Richard Tarnas is Professor Emeritus at CIIS, where he is the founding director of the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness Department. For 30 years, he taught courses in the history of ideas, depth psychology, archetypal cosmology, cultural history, and the evolution of consciousness. He was formerly the Director of Programs and Education at Esalen Institute. He is the author of The Passion of the Western Mind, a narrative history of the Western worldview from the ancient Greek to the postmodern that is widely used in universities. His second book, Cosmos and Psyche, received the Book of the Year prize from the Scientific and Medical Network. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Richard.
Greetings. Thank you, Izzy, and thanks also to Public Programs at CIIS for their kind invitation once again to speak with all of you, this our special community of kindred spirits. This evening, I'm going to do something a little different than I've done in the last several years. I'd like to explore with you some aspects of the deep mystery of the human journey. I suppose that's always in the background of everything that that I aspire to present on, but I want to address it a little bit more directly today. As some of you know, around this time of year, for several years now, going back to the heart of the early depths of the pandemic, 2020, I presented a kind of archetypal weather report on the state of the world, drawing on archetypal astrology to discuss the deeper trends of that were at work in the collective psyche of the time. But this year, I'd like to take a look at what's basically the larger background framework of understanding that informs all those analyses that I've shared here. Now, we could do this in a number of ways. This larger framework is informed by a lot of disciplines. Basically, the fields and disciplines that make up the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, which we call PCC for short, obviously easier to say. So we could approach discussing this framework using the terms of philosophy, which is the lens of philosophy, for example, which is from Plato to Nietzsche, Whitehead, Catherine Keller, Charles Taylor, and beyond, as many of us in PCC do in our courses. But we could also draw on evolutionary cosmology, as Brian Swim has done so fruitfully over the decades here. But tonight, I'd like to pursue our exploration with the lens of depth psychology, which is another discipline central to PCC. And in particular, I'd like to draw on the insights of C.G. Jung as my point of departure. The human journey is a deep, many-layered mystery, as is the human psyche that undergoes that journey. Psyche, of course, is a Greek word, psyche in Greek, and it means soul or inner being, among other things. Also means breath. Thus, but because of this deep connection to the meaning of soul, it has been argued in the depth psychology world, most eloquently by James Hillman, that any true psychology must be a depth psychology, dealing with the depths of soul, with the depth element that underlies consciousness. We could call it the unconscious, but even then, that's just a negative word. What it's not, and also what's unconscious for one person isn't unconscious for another. What's unconscious for some societies or eras of life, cultures, and so forth, may be much more accessible to consciousness in other eras, other cultures, other individuals. But in our time, where depth psychology is particularly um, a, a focused access to these depths, uh, it's important to remember what, as James Hillman memorably put it, where there is a connection to soul, there is psychology. Where not, what is taking place is better called statistics or physical anthropology or cultural journalism or animal breeding, thinking of B.F. Skinner and behaviorism. We could also add now, we could add genetics or neuroscience. Of course, Jung is one of a number of early protagonists of the depth psychology revelation of the late 19th, early 20th century, what Edward Edinger called a new dispensation. The major figures at the birth and emergence of depth psychology certainly include Nietzsche, William James, Freud, and Jung. But actually, depth psychology was a strenuous effort, a joint effort by many women and men without whom it would not have been born. I'm thinking here of people like Lou Salome, who was the remarkable, deep-souled, wise woman who was Nietzsche's muse in her youth, then became Rilke's lover and muse in her uh, adult years. I'm thinking in her 40s, and then finally Freud's muse and friend when she was older, and he was much older as well. Very important part of his life. She always carried kind of like the soul element into their discussions. I'm thinking of Anna O, as she's known in the psychological literature, psychoanalytic literature, whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim, the Viennese feminist who basically taught Freud's teacher, Breuer. She was a patient of his, and she taught Breuer, her therapist, much about how to dive into the deep psyche, how to bring to consciousness what had been suppressed by trauma. She called it chimney sweeping. It had a big effect on Freud. Uh, and of course, there's also Tony Wolff, Sabina Spielrein, Melanie Klein, uh, Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, brilliant minds, Marie-Louise von Franz. Now, I'm I'm beginning. I want to bring our attention at the start here to this phenomenon because it really helps us recognize that depth psychology was made possible by both women and men and by both patients and psychotherapists. In particular, all the distressed souls, often women, but also suffering men, who were coming to psychiatrists' offices in Vienna and in Zurich, uh, in Berlin, canaries in the coal mine of modernity, and carrying uh, somehow together in this field of soul searching and striving for healing. They brought forth in this something new a century ago that is still evolving and that we're still influenced by. It's been a remarkably seminal um, project, the depth psychology impulse. Freud and Jung were themselves suffering souls. They're forced by their own journey to go inward and confront their own unconscious, much as did Nietzsche and William James, or for that matter, Dostoevsky or Virginia Woolf or Kafka. So tonight, using the accumulated insights of depth psychology up to our time, I want to take a look at the profound character of the human journey through that lens. And I'd like to explore the idea that the soul, and this is crucial, I'd like to explore the idea that the soul is being forged by that journey. It was 200 years ago that the great romantic poet John Keats wrote to his brother that he believed that life was the way of soul making. And then it was James Hillman back in the 70s who brought that term from Keats into the vocabulary of depth psychology. At the very beginning of revisioning psychology, which is his masterwork, um, he and that was based, by the way, on his Terry lectures at Yale University in 1972, which was the same series, the Terry lectures, where Jung had given a series of lectures in the late 1930s. So it was at these lectures and then in revisioning psychology that Hillman began his call for a transformation of psychology by quoting Keats on soul making. That was his starting point. What's strange, though, and what's uh, almost never brought up, is that if you actually read Keats's letter to his brother, we can see that Hillman gave a very different meaning to soul making than Keats had originally. Hillman was a genius. He's driven by his own creative daimon, what is as he himself recognized in his later years, how destiny is such a big part of our lives, um, turning fate into destiny is a very important kind of, in a sense, part of soul forging. But when Hillman was putting his great emphasis on soul, he was doing it in a very particular way that was both more kind of postmodern in spirit and also more archaic in this sense. He wanted psychologists to cultivate the polytheistic imagination, to overcome the emphasis on what he called the modern monotheistic heroic ego, with its narrow focus on rational consciousness and the individual conquering will. I better bring my, um, just in case someone from public programs or something needs to reach me. I should gotta make sure I've got it right in front of me. Access. Now, um, so he wanted to overcome that focus on just the mind consciousness as rational consciousness and the individual will. And he had much more, he wanted to break up, in a sense, that monolithic entity of the self and go into the many archetypal uh, parts of ourselves, the polytheistic pleroma that is within us all. And recognizing that, in a certain sense, a rebirth could take place through this um, mm, uh, breaking up of the monolithic and opening up to the multiplicity within us, which is where the deeper sources of life energy could and the imaginative powers of the human being could emerge. Now, I agree totally with Hillman that the imagination is a crucial aspect of soul making, but Keats actually had more than that in mind. He specifically was speaking of soul making as the journey of forging a personal identity, forging one's individual selfhood. This is a self, as Keats saw it, that is painstakingly created through a lifetime of experience, where often the heart must suffer. He said, quote, "We are souls till we acquire, we are not souls till we acquire identities, till each of us is purely the self, purely ourself." We can see this idea of Keats is much closer to Jung's idea of the self archetype, capital S, that deeper, higher, larger self, that our narrower self um, is striving to reunite with, be informed by, be grounded in. Um, and this is closer, therefore, to Jung's idea of individuation, um, which is the long, gradual flowering of one's essential personal identity, a creative identity. that's capable of expressing our wholeness and our depths, not just a shallow social persona that, as one might project onto social media, not just a payoff calculator, uh, a payoff calculating ego, which is seldom the part of ourselves that we see as the most important when we approach the end of life. Uh, a self, an identity, it uh, gives us an interior center that allows us to orient and define our lives through our moral and spiritual vision. It it is a it provides us with a frame of reference and a foundation through which we have some sense of who we are, how we should navigate our lives, where we will take a stand. Here I stand, I can do no other, as Martin Luther said in that great moment of the emergence of the autonomous self as it was taking form in the 16th century through him and many others, Saint Teresa, uh, Shakespeare, Shakespeare's many characters. He's bodying forth the complex modern self through his amazing powers of dramatic articulation. Okay, so let's now go to Jung in particular. It was C.G. Jung who fully brought the idea of life as a spiritually meaningful journey into the field of depth psychology, which was otherwise then being more shaped by Freudian psychoanalysis. Freud's form of psychology was a great breakthrough, opening up the unconscious to the modern mind, reconnecting with what had become repressed. But psychoanalysis was also particularly then, it was also a one-sided child of the rationalist Enlightenment, scientifically aspiring and strenuously based within a disenchanted, mechanistic modern worldview. Now, it's true, Freud was also inspired by Romanticism, the other half of the modern sensibility next to the Enlightenment. I think of the Enlightenment as like the solar and Romanticism as the lunar uh, sides of the larger whole of the modern sensibility that emerges in particularly the 18th, 19th centuries. And Romanticism, with its focus on dreams and visions, religion, myth, the emotions, the imagination, the extremes of human consciousness and the unconscious, um, all that is was inspiring for Freud to become uh, to take the path that he did, and that unconscious he saw as like as an iceberg below the surface. But Freud's tendency was always, as you know, to subject um, these phenomena to a reductionist form of modern reason, to bring these mysteries into alignment with the physical sciences of the 19th century. He was basically continuing the rationalist Enlightenment project by focusing the brilliant light of modern procedural reason and turning it inward on the inner world. Now, Jung um, took all that in, but he also took a stand beyond those limits. Um, and uh, I'm going to just ask, just to make sure that am I recording okay, Izzy or Grace? Just to let me know if excellent. Okay, great. Thank you. Now I'll just go on without interruption. It's always good to check. You never want to give a hour-long lecture that you find out later was not, didn't make it through. So, um, Jung basically was restless with the reductionism of Freud's kind of intellectual predispositions. And of course, they had their own father-son dynamic going on as well. But Jung was able to bring about a fuller synthesis of the Enlightenment and Romanticism, the solar and the lunar. Uh, and of course, we all know here that the understanding of life as a spiritual journey, it's been a widely shared conviction for much of humanity over the centuries. It didn't start with depth psychology, but it took courage to assert this within the scientific and medical world of the early 20th century. And doing so allowed it to connect with the powerful scientific mind and project. And it it's that tension of opposites and the um, the creativity that that can come from holding that tension fully that I think has played such a big role in depth psychology, Jungian psychology, archetypal psychology, transpersonal psychology, all these to be so influential, seminal, fertile as they have been. So Jung and depth psychology helped bring about a shift of sensibility in the 20th century in which the inward journey brought to light a tremendous upsurge from the depths of what had been suppressed by the mainstream Enlightenment orientation. In a sense, the, the romantic depths pushed in, and this is largely, I think, what was causing a lot of the greater awareness of an unconscious in the later 19th century. Why that term and why things like hypnosis and the work of Charcot or William James uh, or the patients coming in with their particular sets of symptoms became so big a deal in the late 19th century is that it too much of soul was being left out by the modern mind and the modern Enlightenment mentality that was very confident in many ways. And also the world that it was creating was starting to be problematic in its radical disenchantment and mechanistic character, which was starting to get actualized in the very um, environment that people lived in. So uh, that so we're at this point we're like moving beyond just executive ego functioning. We're moving beyond instrumental reason. We're moving beyond the mechanistic paradigm. And Jung is playing an important role in this. I remember the late beloved Alan Jones. Some of you will remember him, the eloquent former dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco. Back in 1987, in a conference here I attended in San Francisco called Jung's Challenge to Religion, he began his talk by saying, we live in a post-Jungian world. Now, by this, he meant our world is now not just post-Freudian, it's post-Jungian because so many fundamental Jungian ideas have entered into the sensibility of the postmodern age. I mean, think of like the importance of the collective psyche, of archetypes, of synchronicity, uh, the importance of integrating the feminine and the masculine within all of us, of integrating and balancing thinking and feeling, intuiting and sensing, recognizing the deep unconscious as a source of wisdom, not just a bin of repressed instincts. All these ideas and values are now in common cultural circulation, and that's due to Jung. So let me cite here quickly a few of the what I see as most essential insights that Jung brought into our cultural discourse that I want to single out as relevant for tonight. First, many of us will be familiar with how Jung, in the period roughly between 1913 and 1918, just before and during the great historical trauma of World War I, Jung went through a major descent into his own depths, depths that reached far into the catastrophic turmoil of the collective European soul that had not yet erupted, but he was already feeling and seeing the eruptions in the most vivid terms. And it was an extremely challenging period experience for him. At times, he didn't know if he could retain his sanity. He recorded these experiences, dreams and visions, in the Red Book, as it's called, that was finally opened to the public and published in 2009. Now, out of that great descent, a kind of descent into the underworld, Jung brought several crucial insights to the world. I I like to think of these as they were like hard-won gifts that came to him through his descent into the underworld, rather like those boons that the mythic hero or heroine receives in the underworld to bring back to the larger community that he or she had left during their perilous journey. So first, I'm just going to state a few of these basic insights or gifts, boons, and then we'll unpack them. So first of all, the basic idea that the course of an individual human life is a spiritually meaningful journey of transformation. Again, that may be obvious to most of us listening here now, but it was not so regarded by most psychologists of his time, or indeed many still today, who have rather different sense of what therapy is about and what a well-adjusted um, human being is all about. Jung brought soul and spirit into modern psychology, and he viewed these dimensions of life with the utmost seriousness. But more than that, second, he he recognized that there are powerful forces or principles, which he called archetypal, drawing on the Platonic term. Um, Archetypal forces or principles that influence this spiritual journey of transformation. These can be seen as our version of the gods and goddesses that were experienced by the ancients, as when, for example, a Homeric warrior is suddenly filled with great courage and strength on the battlefield because a god or a goddess has suddenly entered into them, inspired them, given them greater than the strength that they would have otherwise had. Or an athlete during a great race at the Olympic Games, or when a person falls in love through Aphrodite's intervention, um, like Sappho's ode to Aphrodite to get Aphrodite's help in such a love relationship, or or poets inspired by a muse to create great poetry. Um, that's all. These are a lot of modern people reading about those things, reading Homer or Sappho or accounts of uh, the poets describing an Olympic athlete and so forth, like Pindar. They think that this is just being kind of metaphorical, kind of a flowery symbol or something like that. All the evidence points to the fact that the ancients felt and experienced and saw gods and goddesses as vividly as you're seeing me now, or as I am looking at this desk or this computer, and even more vividly than that. These were phenomenologically self-validating. They are very powerful and real in their experience. But today, with all the enormous psychological, spiritual consciousness transformation that has happened over the last several thousand years, um, which is a whole nother story. We teach whole courses trying to unpack that extraordinary um, journey that we've all taken. Today, we may think of these archetypes as being, more like the fundamental structures and forces of the human psyche. We think of them as archetypal complexes. Remember, the word complex is Jung's original word, which Freud and the psychoanalysts picked up and then used with like the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex. But it was originally Jung's coming out of his association experiments at the beginning of the 20th century. So through the phenomenon of highly meaningful synchronicities also, which Jung became more and more compelled by, where he would see these synchronicities as patterning both the inner world and the outer world simultaneously with a shared archetypal patterning that or meaning that unites what doesn't have an obvious linear causal relationship, and yet it's coincidental with such, it has such powerful meaning because of its um, the force of the coincidence between what's happening inside and what's happening outside, that uh, one gets a sense that something more is going on here than well, as uh, Dylan said in his very kind of postmodern way in "It's All Over Now, Baby Blue," that from his great album, Bringing It All Back Home. He said, "The highway's made for gamblers. Better use your sense. Take what you have learned from coincidence." My friend Jeffrey Kripal, many of you know his extraordinary work that he's publishing so much of these days, the great religious scholar. He said to me one day at Esalen, I don't believe in anything really anymore, except I do believe in synchronicities. It's a very kind of postmodern statement of paying attention and recognizing they're like clues. It's like the breadcrumbs or the stones left for Hansel and Gretel to make their way home. So, uh, because of Jung's interest in in synchronicities, he began to realize through that and many other observations that these archetypes can be seen as not just intrapsychic, but that they also have a larger cosmic ontological ground. This is where his astrological researches became so central to his life and to his clinical practice as well as the decades passed. And in that sense, the word archetype that Jung took from the Platonic tradition, applied it to the inner psychological world of the human being in its depths. But at this point, once you start bringing in this larger cosmic ontological ground of archetypes, we're really getting back to its original idea of that they are the Platonic forms or the transcendent ideas, the fundamental cosmic structures of reality itself that one glimpses if you're uh, graced with being able to see beyond the ordinary limited perception, where you can see outside the cave of shadows. And now a third crucial insight from Jung: our individual psyche is deeply embedded in a collective psyche. It's continuous with a collective psyche, which carries all the layered history uh, and the archetypal domain and all of the inherited drives that live within the depths of every individual psyche. And that's why Joseph Campbell would say it so often. At the beginning, he would say at different points when he's talking about Freud and Jung, he would say Freud was fishing while sitting on a whale. Jung recognized the whale. I might add that those of us in this community, like Joseph Campbell himself, have the benefit of even further expansions of the unconscious that Stan Grof articulated, where, in a sense, not just the whale, but the great ocean itself. There's just a lot more inside all of us than just our individual consciousness. We're getting into Whiteheadian territory there. Uh, and Steinerian and yeah, the A field of Irvin Laszlo and so forth. I'll say more about Stan's work later if I can get to it. So now the fourth insight I want to highlight from Jung and is that the larger life and soul of the collective psyche, the history of the human community, that it is itself an unfolding psychological and spiritual process. That is, humanity as a whole is on a spiritual and moral journey. I think really nowhere is this collective journey more vividly expressed in Jung's work than in his late essay, Answer to Job, uh, which was written when he was actually when he was exactly my age, 75. He wrote it in a fever white heat. Uh, Later, near the end of his life, he said this was the only writing in which he would not the only ones of all his writings that he would not now change a word. That's a lot of talking with no water. Excuse me. So, not only is the collective psyche important as being the ground and backdrop of our individual understanding and journey, but it is itself engaged in its own powerful journey of transformation. And this journey is something that each of us is contributing to by our lives, and each of us is being influenced by. That's a crucial point. When someone like Martin Luther King speaks of the arc of the moral universe being long, but it ultimately bends towards justice, words which he drew from Theodore Parker, the great 19th century transcendentalist and abolitionist and feminist. King is referring, and Parker is referring to just this collective historical spiritual journey. It's almost hard to imagine one could talk about an arc of the moral universe if you didn't have some sense of humanity being on a spiritual journey and that we are contributing to it, influenced by it. It is a larger drama that we are all crucially participating in, and perhaps more today than ever before is that participation required, needed, but also available to us in very tangible ways. So, the great archetypal principles and powers also inform this larger historical process. All of these factors are layered deep within each of us, and they play a role in the unfolding of our lives and our sense of selfhood, of identity and personhood, our sense of being on a journey. Now, that means that if we are to be lucid about ourselves and about our motivations, we need to acknowledge and strive to bring into greater consciousness all these layers that exist like archaeological levels in our own depths. It's not just our own personal history, but it's our collective history. It's all of history. It's is there. Our familial and ancestral history, the history of our society, of our culture, our civilization. of Homo sapiens, the history of life, of the earth itself. All this is in our depths and lives within us. And finally, finally, in terms of what we're addressing tonight, of these crucial insights that Jung is bringing to us, he Jung recognized that this human life and the archetypal psyche that is on a journey of transformation, which is both individual and collective, beyond this, he recognizes that all of this is in turn deeply embedded within the larger matrix of the great cosmos itself. From this point of view, not only humanity, but the universe is ensouled. What Jung called the collective psyche seems to be ultimately embedded within the anima mundi, the soul of the universe, anima mundi. Such a beautiful Latin term, anima mundi. Even in our everyday life, those archetypally meaningful synchronicities that we're graced with, including the astral ones, as above, so below, these point to not only the amazing continuous artistry of life, but also to the cosmos as the great sacred circle within which our spiritual lives unfold, where we touch the numinous, the sacred. So let's look more carefully at each of these ideas that informed Jung's vision and practice and that he passed on to us. What does this mean, recognizing that at a deep level, the unfolding of a human life is a spiritual journey? Well, first, a spiritual journey is much more than a story of making it, of personal progress. It involves experiences of loss, of descent, dark nights of the soul, such as many of us are undoubtedly going through right now, experiences of sacrifice, experiences of joys and sorrows that go way beyond personal success in a linear upward climb. Defeats and mistakes can deeply shape us in noble ways. Tragic eras can deeply shape us in noble ways. We are endlessly thinking of our own mistakes and defeats. We're endlessly learning, self-revising. We're endlessly dying to the old and being born into a new, more profound identity that carries the old within us, but now in a transformed way. But a spiritual journey is therefore also a moral journey, one that involves coming to have values, a sense of a higher good, ideals, aspirations that shape who we are. Ideals are not just something, our values are not just something as a kind of, we could have them or not, or a kind of arbitrary add-on to our life. Values and ideals shape who we are, where we stand in order to make sense of our lives, how we decide how to live, how to navigate our lives, what worldviews and what modes of life we commit to, what we choose to cultivate, what standards we choose to live up to. Here I'm drawing especially on the brilliant work of the philosopher Charles Taylor, particularly his great book, Sources of the Self, which he wrote at the time, exact time, same years that I was writing The Passion of the Western Mind back in the 1980s. Our sense of identity is deeply dependent on the values, the goods, the high ideals that inspire us and by which we measure our lives. These allow us to orient our lives, to ground our identity, to have a sense of direction. Even if it's not articulated or made conscious, this moral, spiritual framework of values. It is what allows us to have a grasp on who we are and of how we can best make our way in the world. It's the horizon within which we make meaning in our lives. And if you don't have that, that is an enormous crisis of identity. A person who has a total identity crisis, who completely loses any sense of what's most important in their lives, they lose their grip in moral space, as Taylor would call it. And sometimes this can translate into even losing one's grip in physical space, like a person who's so shocked by something that they've just learned, it's so disturbing that they have to sit down unless lest they completely collapse. They're just taking it in and kind of losing their balance. The psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut has discussed this phenomenon. Now, our moral and spiritual values represent what we find of greatest meaning in our lives. And to live a meaningful life and to discover what is most meaningful to us is, after air and water and food, that's the most important reality to us as human beings. And in certain heroic cases, a loyalty to that deep meaning can outweigh even food and water and air. Now, the connection to meaning, to a sense of what is most important, deep, rich, most worthy of our admiration, what fills us with awe, that's ultimately a connection to the numinous, to something that is consciously or unconsciously experienced as sacred. And this is where the personal touches the transpersonal. It's where the individual touches the archetypal, where the particular touches the universal. Time touches eternity. And this is also where healing takes place, as Jung saw so clearly. Healing ultimately takes place in a direct encounter with the numinous. That's why he had those long, like those letters with Bill Wilson and the founder of AA, recognizing that underlying truth. To be healed from our inner divisions and exiles, to find wholeness that involves touching the numinous, being transformed and healed by some aspect of the sacred. The healing we seek, it never comes simply by human calculation or techniques or clever life hacks, but from somehow accessing a higher wisdom. For each of us to navigate our way in life through, in this very dramatic, challenging age of human history and Earth evolution, it requires sources of insight that go beyond simple strategies for just getting ahead or coping with life. But to find our way to a place where we can be open to an encounter with the numinous requires entering into a crucible of transformation, a place of great stresses and tensions, tensions of intolerably incompatible opposites, where in some sense we must go through a dying to the shallower life and the narrower identity, so that we can enter into an encounter with depths and heights that are far beyond the parameters of our ordinary consciousness, which is for most of us shaped by a relentlessly consumerist, disenchanted modernity. Such a crucible of transformation, it can emerge in many, many ways. It can happen through powerful rituals, non-ordinary states of consciousness, a wilderness vision quest. It can happen in a sacred medicine journey, an ayahuasca ceremony, breath work, deep experiential therapy, Jungian analysis. It could be a spontaneous spiritual emergency, or a near-death experience. Here, I want to make a shout out to our own Jesse Estrin and his brother Elliot for their great work on the Coming Home um, uh, series and Substack and YouTube channel, where it's called Coming Home, and it where they bring the amazing testimony of many near-death experiences to the public. By the way, I need to let you know we've had, as probably many of you have had as well today, we've got this atmospheric river that's been coming through pretty powerfully this week. A lot of raining and winds today here where I live and in Marin. And so if I suddenly disappear, that's what happens. But I think we're holding on so far. Okay. Um, So it could be a near-death experience, as I said, or a spiritual emergency, such as Stan Groff uh, developed such a helpful um, understanding of and ways of responding to. It could also be, though, a severe illness. It could be a major accident. Um, it could be the tragic loss of a beloved. It could be a terrible life failure. All of these the sacred medicine journeys, the powerful ritual, all of these create the possibility of a liminal passage through dying into another mode of being. The transcendent function emerges at that point and grace can occur. I wonder if I've got that wonderful letter from Jung to Olga Patang. Uh, I'll just bring that up here. It's a Olga Frobe Kaptein was someone who had oh, I know where I can get it. Of course, they didn't have the right book right behind me. Uh, it's worth bringing up from the depths of my computer here, so everybody can have a breath. Oh, by the way, in terms of my our schedule for tonight, I'm speaking up until half half past the hour, roughly another half an hour, and then we open up to Q&A. So that's the plan. And here we go. So Jung wrote this in 1945, August 20th. So he would have just turned 70 at that point, um, just as the Second World War is ending. He's also been through his near-death experience by this point, a very powerful one that happened the year before. It had a really big influence on him that he wrote about in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. But this letter is a powerful one. Often, a lot of his best articulations are in his personal letters. Somehow freedom, somehow when he was writing for the public, with some exceptions like Answer to Joe, when he was writing for the public, he kind of hedged things more and became maybe more prosaic. But sometimes when he would be writing a letter, he would really deliver. So Frau Frobe was the person who owned uh, Casa Eranos, where the great Eranos symposia took place each summer that Jung kind of helped oversee, and where many of his most important essays and those were first read. Things like synchronicity or on the Trinity and so forth, but also where many others like Karl Karenyi and later Hillman, et cetera, were to speak. So she had written him about the conflict that she felt between her duties to her family and her responsibilities to her career and the demands of each. And he wrote this letter. Dear Frau Frobe, there can be no resolution, only patient endurance of the opposites which ultimately spring from your own nature. You yourself are a conflict that rages in itself and against itself in order to melt its incompatible substances, the male and the female. I would put it the solar and the lunar, to de-essentialize it from gender, um, in the fire of suffering, and thus create that form which is the goal of life. Everyone goes through this mill, consciously or unconsciously, voluntarily or forcibly. We are crucified between the opposites and delivered up to the torture until the reconciling third takes shape. See, that's the transcendent function that can only emerge when one has held the agonizing tension kind of loyally enough, not throwing it off into one or the other. Do not doubt the rightness of the two sides within you, and let whatever may happen, happen. The apparently unendurable conflict is proof of the rightness of your life. A life, that's an amazing sentence. The unendurable conflict is proof of the rightness of your life. A life without inner contradiction is either only half a life or else a life in the beyond, which is destined only for angels. But God loves human beings more than the angels. With kindest regards, yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. That's this trickster coming in there at the end about God loving human beings more than the angels, um, which some theosophists believe as well. I mean, not putting it in that way though. So that's a path towards rebirth, a path towards moving, dying to the old identity, um, but and then being able to encounter the kind of numinous healing of the reconciling whole emerging. But it's also not that simple because even the numinous and the sacred myths and the encounter with the archetypal, they're two-edged swords and they require discernment. As even a moment's reflection on the history of religion can make clear to us, having an experience of the sacred or of the numinous is no guarantee of moral discernment and life-enhancing action. Oh man, I just watched this extraordinarily powerful six-part series on Netflix called American Primeval. Not for the faint of heart, but a very powerful moral drama. Um, anyway, it makes this point about just because someone is invoking God and feels filled with God's inspiration to carry their manifest destiny into realization is no guarantee of the good. Of As my friend Dean Juhan used to say, the closer that you get to the light doesn't mean the farther away from the darkness you're getting, which we see so often in the case of you know, certain gurus and spiritual leaders that go wrong in one way or another, with filled with the divine inflation. So it's and what's behind this is that it's the very nature of archetypes to compel us, and their intrinsic multivalence, including this kind of moral bivalence, it puts great responsibility on us to discern and cultivate the noblest potential of the archetypal complex rather than its destructive shadow. And it can take great work on our part to become conscious of our shadow and of these powerful archetypes that move in our soul and in our lives. It can take great discernment to know how to navigate amongst these complexes that can bedazzle us as well as inspire us. This is why Hillman, when he was describing the power and the ambiguity and the nature of archetypes, he described them this way. One thing is absolutely essential to the notion of archetypes: their emotional possessive effect, their bedazzlement of consciousness so that it becomes blind to its own stance. By setting up a universe which tends to hold everything we do, see, and say in the sway of its cosmos, an archetype is best comparable with a god. And gods, religions sometimes say, are less accessible to the senses and to the intellect than they are to the imaginative vision and emotion of the soul. I mean, just think of like when you get totally possessed by an anger that reaches to the point of rage, and how filled with it, and how righteous you can feel, and how absolutely wrong and deserving, perhaps even evil, the person that has aroused your rage is. Um, and think of times when you were fortunate and didn't act on it, and and then later, after the storm, the archetypal complex has diminished, and you get a little bit hold of your center again. You go, wow, uh, I really got carried for a ride. Archetypes can carry you for a ride, and that's something that requires a certain building up of a center, of a moral center, which is what this is all about that we're talking about tonight. Keats's soul making, forging of an identity, being capable of making a stand. Let me share also here a wonderful passage from the remarkable 20th century British novelist John Cooper Powys, someone who Sean Kelly has a special uh, um, connection with. I love this passage where he says, "If by the time we're 60 we have not learned what a knot of paradox and contradiction life is," knot is Knot, "what a knot of paradox and contradiction life is, and how exquisitely the bad and the good are mingled in every action we take, we have not grown old to much purpose. I suppose the hardest of all things to learn, and the thing that most distinguishes what is called a ripe old age, is the knowledge that while bold, uncritical action is necessary if things are to move at all, we are only heading for fresh disaster if some portion of our interior soul does not function in critical detachment while we commit ourselves to the tide, keeping a weather eye on both horizons." I love that. That's wisdom. And he was very he's got the Jungian influence in there as well as Robertson Davies, who makes the quotes that at the beginning of a collection that he published, is makes that point, the connection to Jung. So what I've been attempting here to describe is the challenge of carrying the psychological attitude while also being a person of action. And I felt Powys nailed it in that respect. He managed to provide a few more metaphysical indications as well. And I think this seems applicable to the unfolding of human history as well. Whole nations can get possessed by archetypal complexes and be absolutely convinced in the rightness of their cause. And it's a sacred duty to serve this what this very powerful impulse or leader is telling us to do. Um, and great destruction can take place from it. And it takes a lot of discernment by a lot of people and a lot of courage to to write to turn around the ship in time. And so we've 20th century history was filled with very dramatic examples of this. Above all, the two world wars. but not just there. And certainly, U.S. history has been filled with its own cases, and ours again is in our time. So I've got a few more minutes that I'd like to start to. I'm going to use a couple of diagrams here to give even a little bit more sense of the layering within our own depths of all the things that are shaping our consciousness and the larger range of influences that are acting on us from within our deep psyche. Um, so I'm going to share my screen and uh, I'll do that by, let's see, here we go. So this first diagram will be familiar to some of you who have taken courses with Stan Groff and myself over the years, or seminars, workshops, but also the Psyche and Cosmos classes that are being taught at CIIS now by Richard Tarnas. You'll and, or it's also you see it in some of Stan's books. This is a diagram that we kind of co-created. I started with the hourglass to show the relationship of the personal unconscious with the transpersonal unconscious. And so here we are up at the top. Uh, I'm not going to go into what all the coexes are and stuff like that or the BPMs. It's a more general point I want to make here. So here's us up at the top, just the very surface, ordinary ego consciousness that we tend to have during the day as we go about our business. But when people do deep inner work, through sacred medicine journeys, through deep psychotherapy, through all the other things that I brought up, can come in through dreams, symptoms, and so forth. And you start exploring the depths, you start going in deeper and deeper into one's life and earlier experiences going earlier and earlier that have shaped us, both positive emotional ones and negative ones, traumatic ones. And as one goes deeper and deeper, then one eventually starts encountering experiences of encountering death. And this can often be mixed in with the experience of reliving birth, a biological birth. It doesn't have to, but this narrowing of the hourglass represents a kind of tunnel of liminal, a kind of liminal passage of birth and death. And it, when one enters into these depths here, that's where the archetypal, it can come through in fetal perinatal memories, but it also can come through in quite powerful archetypal experiences, mythic experiences that play a role in the death rebirth process. And both mixed in with that powerful liminal passage, but also even after one has gone through that liminal passage, one then starts tapping into the much larger kind of cosmic whole, the transpersonal unconscious. Here's where things like ancestral memories, for example, mythological experiences, phylogenetic memories, like the history of Homo sapiens, of mammalians, of life itself, all encoded deep within us and that we have access to inside us. But also karmic memories. This is something that Jung did not emphasize, but we can, but certainly the work from consciousness research from many different sources, including LSD therapy and hypnosis and so forth. The experience of past lives and karmic memories playing a large role in shaping our own current experience and our own lives. It tends to come up again and again. And then collective memories of all kinds, large, like becoming all um, mothers who have ever given birth, all soldiers who have died on a battlefield, all people who have experienced imprisonment unjustly or who have been enslaved. These things, all these are inside us. And um, in these liminal conditions, they can start coming into our awareness, and we start to get insights into how certain depths within us that transcend this lifetime are actually shaping our 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 current consciousness and our sense of identity and so forth. And so, but in addition, and that's something that came to stand in me quite surprisingly. I've talked about it in this setting at other times, so I won't go into detail here. But basically, the discovery that the archetypal psyche, the archetypal unconscious, the anima mundi, the cosmic soul, is archetypally associated with the heavens and with the great surrounding well, we've got them down here at the foundational, the bottom of the transpersonal. But if you were looking at this from above, this would be much bigger. You'd look at the narrower ego consciousness here of our individual self, and then you'd be getting into much bigger wholes of, WHOLE, much greater um, realms of the ancestral unconscious and the many lives of the karmic, the phylogenetic, all of Earth history, life history, etc. But and then and the outer circumference, which this is are the heavens, and the heavens with the sun, the moon, the planets, astonishingly seem to be systematically associated with, like gods in the heavens, the way the ancients saw them, with these great archetypal powers or gods and goddesses. Um, Moreover, there's something about biological birth that the moment of birth, um, and it's more complex than that because we bring in conception and all these kinds of things, but particularly the first breath and the moment of birth, at the moment that the individual organism becomes uh, independent and biologically from the maternal womb and emerges, that where the planets are at that time, the state of the heavens at that moment, in some sense, is correlated with the state of the psyche of the being born at that time. And um, that's something that, well, has that beautiful sentence in Memories, Dreams, Reflections in a chapter called Late Thoughts, where he said the very structure of the universe is set up in accord, or with or rather, the structure of the psyche is set up in accord with the great structure of the universe, so that the microcosm of our self is in some sense embedded in and coherent with the great macrocosm, and the archetypal differentiation that the long astrological tradition has helped discern, going back to the ancient Mesopotamians, Babylonians, Greeks, Egyptians, uh, the Islamic world, and then the medieval and Renaissance Europeans. All these have carried this very powerful discerning tradition into our own time in such a way that when the depth psychology revolution came in and Jung was able to see the connections, and then we've been developing these quite a bit further in recent years, and we also have the benefit of much greater, like, telescopic and computer powers and ephemerides and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, come back, and here what I'm particularly wanting to emphasize is the fact that um, the archetypal cosmos is within us and around us, and that the great there's a great gift and grace that exists as a result of this microcosm, macrocosm, as above, so below, um, deeper I, uh, embeddedness of our individual soul in the cosmic soul. There's a great um, grace and gift that the cosmos has given us, um, opening an avenue of communication between human symbolic consciousness, which after all has been painstakingly evolved over millennia, over millions of years, uh, and a cosmos that speaks symbolically, which every indigenous uh, tribal tradition and as well as the great archaic civilizations was in touch with. Uh, they they were able to read. They recognized that the universe speaks symbolically. Nature speaks symbolically. Um, the birds, the forest, the wind, the waters, the heavens, the sun and moon, their cycles, everything is connected. As Plotinus said, everything breathes together and is um, communicating with us if we have ears to hear, if we cultivate the capacity to discern those depths. And the universe also, this intelligent, um, soul infused, gracious universe holds space for our initiatory transformations as individuals and as a species. Um, just as we in our communities, like the different, what I call heroic communities that exist in our world with a higher vision of the good than the mainstream culture, we support each other as individuals to find our own paths, and that is a path that requires often quite challenging, painful, transformational experiences, such as Jung went through in the Red Book period. Um, okay, speaking of yeah, that individual that the individuality of our journey. Um, that's another paradox is that while we are all on this collective journey together that is subsumes us and is ultimately so important, and as we get older and older, I think it's more possible to tune into the importance of the generations, 7 generations hence, and so forth, and not just be thinking about the my own or the immediate moment or uh, the the quarterly profit report, um, but to be thinking in the long term. Um, Nevertheless, we are each individuals on an individual journey, and each of us has a unique path. Um, And that sense of our individuality is something that, in its contemporary form, has only emerged after many centuries of cultural and psychological evolution. Earlier identities were much more with the tribe, with the tribal whole, which is embedded in the land and filled with identified with the ancestral spirits, with the great spirits of the land and the water, and that was the primary identity. And one did not do things as individuals that were not, in some sense, in close confluence with this whole. Uh, it's only over a long period of time that and modernity has played the crucial role. Well, medieval period as well played a crucial role in constellating this individuality. Um, and in our own time, we have a profound sense of the importance of the individual journey and of our unique path. Uh, which particularly came out of, let's see, yeah, I've got about 5 more minutes where I'm going to be talking here. Um, in some ways, it was the great encounter with mortality in the later Middle Ages, uh, where you not only had, tremendous turmoil, the Black Death, the plague carrying away so many of the European population, the wars, the famines, etc. But you also had a a particular interpretation of the Christian mythos coming out of Augustine and um, Ambrose and others who put a focus on a juridical penal understanding of uh, the human being's relationship to God, that we are all going to be judged at death, and that the result of that judgment would be heaven or hell. Later, purgatory emerges as a somewhat partly out of, yeah, for many reasons it emerged as an almost psychologically necessary intermediate zone. But if you're being taught year after year, week after week, that your fate, your eternal fate of absolutely intolerable perdition, hell, exiled forever from God's love, suffering physically, spiritually, in the most unimaginable ways. If you're being taught that that is a very likely possibility if you don't shape up, if you don't live a highly moral life, if you don't do, um, and that the reward for doing so is the most blissful, ecstatic unity with the Godhead forever and ever, where any pleasure you've ever had in this life pales compared with the ecstatic um, joy that would extend into infinity if you live a good life. Well, you can imagine how this would shape the individual interior consciousness that was emerging in the later Middle Ages in ways that would not have been necessary if you had much more of a sense that your life as you die is going into the life of the whole, into the tribal ancestral continuum, into the rest of nature, etc. No, this is a very different sense. Um, if your eternal fate, bliss or damnation, is being determined through the judgment of the Almighty that you're going to have to face at the moment of death, well, that concentrates your mind. Like Samuel Johnson's nothing like a hanging to concentrate a man's mind. Um, even, I mean, the encounter with death can certainly do that, but if you've got a belief system where what's after death has those kinds of qualities, well, then you you really have a lot of reason to become very, very, very introspective and self-aware and inhibiting certain instincts, building up a conscience, a superego that helps you make decisions not according to just what the flow of the society is doing, but as an individual, because it's you by yourself that's going to be assessed at that crucial moment. So this is an enormous psychologically forging um, process that took place and is in the background uh, uh, of all of our soul experiences in modernity, particularly Westerners. And this is powerfully described in Charles Taylor's later work called A Secular Age, and the first brilliant chapter there. But you can also some of the if you just read uh, James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the chapter 3, where the brilliant sermon on the nature of hell that the young artist hears at his retreat, um, Catholic retreat, is in 19th century Ireland. you would get a very powerful sense of what I'm talking about. The other person on the Protestant side who powerfully conveys the nature of it is Max Weber in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Brilliant psychological and sociological examination of just what we're talking about here. Um, but beyond these, our contemporary sense of each individual having his or her own journey to take, um, your path, that idea that your path is for your steps alone, that each of us has a responsibility as well as a right to find our own creative way in life that expresses our true self, to be able to bring forth our own gifts and capacities that are uniquely ours to fulfill our own destiny. We have a much more strong sense of this in our time, and this emerged really out of Romanticism, which in the late 18th and 19th century, that really brought forth that kind of awareness and disseminated it into the modern sensibility. Both a right and a responsibility, uh, a sacred right and a sacred responsibility, you might say. There is a road, no simple highway, between the dawn and the dark of night. And if you go, no one may follow. That path is for your steps alone. That's the Grateful Dead, of course, in 1970 from their wonderfully deep-souled album American Beauty, and the lyrics of the late Robert Hunter. Um, Now, Jung is the inheritor of all this, of the ancients, of the indigenous tribal primal traditions, of the archaic civilizations. He's and with including their astral uh, esoteric traditions that got planted into the continuum. He's taking in so much of like Judaism, Christianity. It lives in him so strongly. The Enlightenment, Romanticism, modern science. He's the inheritor of all of this, and his sense of the individual journey uh, was very much framed. And this is the last thing I'll say before we take our. I'm going to take a couple-minute break, and then uh, come right back, and we will do Q&A. Um, but Jung's sense of the individual journey, as important as it was, he had such a sense of the importance of our individuality, our sacred responsibility with respect to that individuality. That's what individuation is all about. But it is an individuation that is deeply connected to the whole, to the entire history, to the collective journey that's within us and around us, and that we have a responsibility towards that collective journey. And that's expressed in the famous passage from The Undiscovered Self that he wrote near the end of his life when he was 80 at that point, about the dramatic kairos of our time in history. You've heard me, many of you will have heard me quote this in the past or in my books. A mood of universal destruction and renewal has set its mark on our age. This mood makes itself felt everywhere, politically, socially, and philosophically. We are living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols. This peculiarity of our time, which is certainly not of our conscious choosing, is the expression of the unconscious human within us who is changing. I would say of the earth that is changing as well. Um, Coming generations will have to take account of this momentous transformation if humanity is not to destroy itself. I would say this generation our generation, and all who are alive today, have to take account of this momentous transformation if humanity is not to destroy itself through the might of its own technology and science and egotism and greed. So much is at stake, And so much depends, and here's where he comes back to the individual. After all that about the collective, here he comes back to the individual. So much is at stake, and so much depends on the psychological constitution of the modern human. Does the individual know that he or she is the make weight that tips the scales, that infinitesimal unit on whom a world depends? Like the world depends on each of us as individuals to play our role in this great collective arc of the moral universe, this spiritual journey we are on. Okay, um, so let's take a 2 minute break. We'll come back and we'll the my host here will give me um, uh, the questions that many of you have posted, and then we'll go from there. So see you in just a second. Sa asks, you mentioned Freud's relationship with a prominent feminist and his influence on the theory of chimney sweeping, but his psychoanalytic theories were noted for being misogynistic, as seen in Dora's case. Absolutely. Um, Castration theory and more. Can you elaborate your perspective on what else may have contributed to his failure to integrate feminism in his theories, such as compartmentalization or practicing cognitive dissonance, in addition to the more obvious Victorian era misogyny or patriarchy? Let me clarify. Um, that was Bertha Pappenheim, who I was talking about, and that was she was not Freud's patient. She was Freud's teacher's patient, Breuer. Freud's first book was a co-written with Breuer on studies in hysteria was the name of it, and that's the thing is that uh, yeah he didn't get a direct transmission, as it were, from Bertha von Pappenheim. Um, we are so shaped by the assumptions that we grow up within, the social milieu, the values that shape the society, and um, 19th century Europe, Vienna, um, pretty much all of the European North Atlantic world was tremendously patriarchal, and that patriarchy, you know, I mean, just think how recently it was that scholars um, began to question using the word man to represent both uh, to represent the whole human species, the whole human being, male, female, non-binary, and so forth. It it's it's a it's been a long journey. I mean, and this isn't the topic for today. Would be worth discussing in depth because it is such an enormous issue. But depth psychology, like I mean, on the one hand, there were more women playing a big role in Jungian psychology than there were women uh, in psychoanalysis in their early years. Although Melanie Klein was a huge influence, and Anna Freud, and they were opponents in many ways. Anna Freud's they're both brilliant. Um, Read Anna Freud's mechanisms of the ego and mechanisms of defense. Quite a brilliant book. And there's a number of other important women psychoanalysts from that early generation. But yeah, I if you read like the case of Dora, it's it's appalling how Freud could, in this all too human way, rationalize, compartmentalize, etc. But it was so endemic to his era, and God knows still in our own era. And while I never want to um, obscure the the shadow of the many thinkers and leaders that have played a role in our history, in shaping us and inspiring us, even artists. Um, I mean, like what we're doing right now, dealing with Alice Munro, for example, the brilliant Canadian short story writer, and what's come to light from her daughters and that family's uh, revelations. I mean, it is an enormous challenge right now to simultaneously appreciate and uh, be aware of the shadow of, uh, and in a sense, we have to do that with ourselves too, to a great extent. So I cert I think everything that you mentioned are those are all factors that relate to Freud. And Freud was Jewish. He had his own tremendous oppressive structure, social structure that he was dealing with as a Jew in Vienna, the turn of the century. Um, uh, a lot of compensatory um, assertion of intellectual strength and uh, brilliance, etc., would be going into that compensation. So anyway, those are some thoughts on that deep issue. Thanks for bringing it up, Sa. Question from Jana. I would, or yeah. Can you say more about synchronicity and archetypal pattern meaning during this current time? What clues should we be paying attention to? Well, um, okay, so on the one hand, there's the omens that one, if this were in the Egyptian or Roman Empire and something equivalent happened to what happened at the first week of a new um, pharaoh's reign or king's reign, emperor's reign, equivalent to what happened in Washington, D.C. and the Potomac, right as a certain new administration and leader comes into power. Uh, that's that's something to pay attention to. And I think also in terms of the astrological archetypal factors, in terms of where the planets are right now, um, I've given the last several years, and these are all easily available on the CIIS Public Programs site, where I did one 2020, 2021, 2022, and each one builds on the one before. And then I skipped a year in 23, I think, and then I did one last year in 24. And all these are setting out just that kind of thing. If you're interested in the archetypal cosmology part of this frame of reference, and uh, I do say things about the current time. I also will be talking more directly to that for something for the National Council of Geocosmic Research, for whom I'm speaking in April on April 19th. Um, NCGR San Francisco. You can that you can tune into just by going on the website and seeing when it emerges. But those are also recorded, and you can see them later, just as these are recorded. Um, so and you can go to things like the astrology podcast, where Chris Brennan does his interviews, and there's a lot of astrologers out there putting things out. I bring a particular perspective that is especially focused on the archetypal dynamics of our time and of history, which I laid out in Cosmos and Psyche. And actually, the last chapters of Cosmos and Psyche do address some of the powerful complexes that are activated right now are being constellated. Um, Let me also say a couple of other things. Those, in terms of resources, um, because people often ask about these kinds of things. Uh, I would say, let's see if I got it right here. Sorry for the delay. Yeah, so first, there's for those who would like individual readings for from an archetypal perspective that's very much been informed by the kinds of things that I was presenting here today. And these people came out of the PCC program, brilliant. You may know them already. Um, I would I would point to Chad Harris. Go to archetypal view. Just bring up archetypal view on the on your computer on your search engine, and Chad gives very deep readings that are informed. He used to, I mean, and also he's got a channel there that has many of my lectures are available there. I think he recorded most things that I lectured on over about a 20 plus year period at CIIS. And then Lily Falconer, who many of you know, is kind of manager, coordinator of the PCC program, but was a and is a graduate of PCC. And if you go to, and she's also a counseling archetypal astrologer, and if you go to Lily Falconer astrologer.com, you can see about signing up with her. Both deeply insightful, very kind and empathic people who also have the technical knowledge to help in this way. Um, and yeah, just while I'm just doing resources, go. Another thing is if you want to follow your own transits and also to see where the world transits are, just yourself, with along with interpretations that I and others have provided, you can go to Archetypal Explorer, another alumnus of PCC. Uh, Kyle Leimetter put this together over many years. Archetypal Explorer, very elegant diagrams, which I've used at times in some of these past sessions, and I probably will at the NCGR one in April. There you can follow your own personal transits along with or the world transits with really elegant graphics and so forth. Um, and if you're interested in the philosophical side of the kind of thing that I've been presenting, Jake Sherman, Matt Siegel, and Sean Kelly are really carrying they're all three profound philosophers and deeply spiritual and can bring you a great sense of history and can they're they're teaching courses as we speak, and it's a great privilege that we have them here in our community. Um, and then for those of you who want to, with the work of Stanislav Grof and Jung, transpersonal psychology and archetypal astrology, Becca Tarnas is teaching also in the PCC program, brilliantly carrying this work. She's writing a biography of Stan Grof as well, and and then she and Sean Kelly are also teaching on Jung right now, and I'm sure they will again in the future. So two last sources of kind of resources for you to draw on, depending on what you're looking for. In terms of gender equity and reconciliation, um, the wonderful, incredible work of Will Keepan and Cynthia Bricks, also connected here to CIIS, and wonderful people who have been for decades bringing their work on healing um, gender trauma and bringing more and more like love and understanding. And this is to India, to South Africa, here in the United States, Canada. It's a very powerful work. So if you just look up GERI, or Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, that work is extremely noble and one of the great contributions to our time. And for those of you interested in psychedelic therapy training, the Groff Legacy trainings that are happening around the world, including involving people who are PCC graduates, like the Scandinavian group, the Nordic group is one. There's another in uh, Spanish-speaking countries that Javier, um, I'm missing his last name. Uh, Javier, sorry, is has been overseeing. That's really great work. Also, there's one in the Slavic countries, and coming out of Prague. So these are all resources for you to draw on. Okay, can you say more about synchronicity and archetypal pattern meaning during this current time? I want to just say something about synchronicity apart from astrology and archetypal patterns and that we can pay attention to in the planets and history. And that is synchronicity itself, which I would say probably most people in listening to me today have observed pretty powerful, meaningful coincidences that make them that pay attention to something more is going on than mere random mechanistic unfolding of life. That there's something deeper, larger, more intelligent, spiritually meaningful that's at work to be able to bring about these remarkable events. I've given I've given a number of lectures. I've been part of a scientific and medical network project coming out of the Galileo Commission on synchronicity. And there was a book that was just published by a number of us that have been part of this, scholars and scientists, researchers that have been part of this project. And the name of that book that just came out is The Playful Universe. And you can also just go to Scientific and Medical Network and pull up uh, a number of lectures that have been given there, including by myself on synchronicity. I also gave one for the Paris Center in Italy not too long ago. I gave it as an online presentation, and the Paris Center did a whole series. And I particularly I gave the leadoff one. Um, That's PARI, Paris Center. And I'm quite sure that you can access these lectures, and I go pretty deep into the nature of synchronicity there. And there's also a subsequent one by Roderick Main, Main, a British academic scholar with really one of the leading. He's got a number of books on synchronicity and Jung, and really one of the leading scholars in that area. So I think that would be worth looking at as well. Okay, we've got 6 more minutes and three more questions, so I will be concise. The idea of the universal embeddedness of the archetypal human principles reflected in world and personal transits, that is universe-wide. Does that mean those principles might be applicable to self-reflective beings on other planets? It's comforting to think these principles are ensouled around the galaxies, but there's no evidence for this. It seems like a Neptunian bridge to nowhere. Let's get back to the Saturnian here and now. How can I, in this present embodiment, actualize the ideals that I tune to my sacred soul progress, and how may I make my way in the world and find meaningfulness to spur me toward my destiny? Well, um, I I think you're kind of saying two different things, but I'm totally in agreement with we have to pay attention to our our world and as you say, a kind of the Saturnian here and now. But Neptunian bridge to nowhere is a bit of a mischaracterization. The Neptune archetype can be a bridge to, you know, unrealistic fantasy, illusion, delusion, um, meaningless fantasia, hallucinations, etc., of no carrying no deeper meaning. But Neptune is also the archetypal principle that connects us to the deepest spiritual and mystical unity of all things. It is what also rules our visions and dreams, our capacities to um, to see and understand symbolically. Neptune is not just a single bridge to nowhere. It too is a multivalent archetype. And the fact that the universe, now, it takes um, a certain epistemological and psychological openness, a kind of opening of the heart as well as the mind, to be able to acknowledge the possibility that the universe could care enough about this earth, about our planet, our moving earth going through around the sun and moving through the galaxy, that somehow the cosmos itself and the planets and the sun and moon in some sense carry meaning with respect to the earth. Because remember, everything that's in the astrological framework is with respect to the earth. It's 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 centered. It's as if the universe cares enough about this earth and about individuals on this earth, and every moment that has its own archetypal signature it cares about, in the way that the overflow of the divine goodness has capable. And to negate that grace, that gift, that bathing of the planet in a kind of love of with its meaning is to negate that is in some ways an impoverishment. On the other hand, if this were a different setting, course, lecture, I would point out how important it was for the modern self and modern mind to negate it. It was part of it of the emergence and evolution and forging of an autonomous self that would no longer feel that its fate was being controlled by the planets. We had to come into a different relationship to the anima mundi. See, that's the trick. That's the key issue of our, one of the key issues of our time. It's we need to um, not just rediscover the anima mundi, we need to forge a new relationship to the anima mundi. The universe has been gradually, painstakingly forging, cultivating, constellating a partner, an autonomous self that has responsibilities and that could love the whole freely. This is essential to Rudolf Steiner, for example. Um, and so I think we are at a point right now where we can engage in the possibility of a sacred marriage um, between the human and the cosmos, between the part and the whole, between sun and moon and so forth. That's a whole nother lecture. One last thing. Question from Amel, I think this is. Can you give us an example of how this knowledge helped you lead a more harmonious and bolder life? How can one use this in her own evolution? Well, I'd be happy to discuss that. But it's now the end of our time, 8 o'clock, and I think I should just say that uh, it has played an enormous role, both in times of great difficulty. It helped me take in the tremendous trauma of, say, 9/11, or of um, or even personal tragedies or mistakes, etc. It's also helped me with the most joyful creative periods of my life and being in touch with that and being able to track it to be able to live more skillfully. It's like an ongoing weather forecast which tells you which way the wind is blowing and how potently and what and whether it's a good time to go out in your sailboat, and if so, how to sail, where how to surf, etc. It increases the um, sources of intelligence that we can draw on to lead a more skillful and self-aware and intelligent life, compassionate. Okay, on that note, I will say goodbye to everybody. I'm very grateful to all of you who might be out there listening to me tonight. The only problem with doing this online compared with doing it in Namaste Hall as I used to, or in other settings, is that I don't get to be right with you in the room, experience you more directly, see the looks on your faces, get inspired by how you're responding to things. But I think all of us who have been doing a lot of online lectures have gotten better and better at kind of intuitively tuning into the field that we are speaking to and within, and being inspired by it in that kind of less tangible way than we had available when we see each other in person. But until we see each other in person again, I am going to sign off now. Thank you all for being with me, and I hope some of what I have said will be of value in your life. Thank you very much. Bye bye.